Hello. Today we're going to talk about communication through music and how the generation of the 60s was particularly affected. Communication through music intensified through the decade of the 60s with how it affected social understanding and cultural changes, and how music was the catalyst for those changes. One online site states that the 60s were a decade of great musical changes. That's the 60s.net. These changes being seen through many modes: lyrics, rhythms and beats, and how instruments were used. Music's communicative power was also seen in how it changed people's feelings towards social changes and pushed the envelope when compared to what was known previously. No longer was the generation going to accept what was the norm. And that was seen in dance, patriotism, racism, and dress and grooming. So with all these things, we're looking to see how music was able to communicate through the 60s. First, music's influence was seen in lyrics. In the 60s, the lyrics changed from what was known in the past decade with having a good time to social responsibility. More of that was seen in the 60s with anti-war songs, anti-racism songs, and songs that meant to tie the human spirit closer together. Rhythms and beats also seemed to change in the 60s. The beat was faster. It was made more to dance, louder, more intense. These are the beats and rhythms that changed in the 60s from what was known previously in the 40s and the 50s. 40s we had the big band. 50s you had the sock hops. Well, the 60s used more instruments and rhythms and beats to change how people understood music. And that was seen with the instruments. Instruments had a great influence in how they were perceived. And also with the rhythms and beats, the Time magazine once said that it was now a kinetic sound, that it was something that energized the new generation. Instruments, as we talked about, turned electrical. They were no longer acoustic. Electrical instruments were now used to convey the messages of the music. Music's power of communication was also seen in how it affected social understanding. The first we see it in dance. In the 60s, dance was understood as being more solitary than what was known in the 50s. In the 50s, people were partnered together. But in the 60s, as one online source put it, solo became ever more popular with the changes in how music was understood on the dance floor. So people no longer wanted to dance together. We had songs like The Twist. Those are songs that came out in the 60s, and now you didn't need a partner to dance. Patriotism. Music, as it was understood in the 40s and 50s, used to resonate patriotism. But in the 60s, it was almost anti-war, with songs like from Creedence Clearwater Revival, 69. Those are the songs that changed, in that no longer people thought that patriotism was the most important thing in American society. Another was racism. Racism began to close the chasm that had existed decades earlier, in the 40s and the 50s. Now granted, there was race issues in the 60s, but the music began to communicate with artists like Marvin Gaye. These artists began to change how people understood music, and that race relations were no longer an issue. The other thing was in dress and grooming. In the 60s, music influenced how people dressed and groomed. You begin to see the movement to the hippies. No longer was everything so as conservative as it was decades before. Everything was now more liberal. Women were throwing their bras away. Men were no longer cutting their hair or tucking their shirts in. These are the things that music influenced those things in society. So these are many of the things that we learned in the 60s that show that music communicated change, that music is a mode and a medium for communication. Just how it helps people to understand how they see things. Music was able to change how people felt about lyrics, rhythms and beats, and instruments. Also, in the 60s, music was able to affect dance, patriotism, racism, and dress and grooming. All the different modes and mediums showed how music's influence and how it communicated with people was a strong medium to show that music was a communication factor. Thank you.